President.
The Republican whip.
Madam President, it's hard to believe that my friend Richard Burr is leaving Congress. He's someone I've known since my days in the House of Representatives, and we've been friends from the very beginning. And so it's difficult to imagine serving in the Senate here without him. We came to the Senate in the same year as well. Our wives are very close friends, and we've had many wonderful times with the Burrs. In fact, I've enjoyed hosting Richard in South Dakota on a number of occasions. Richard is an outdoors guy, as I am, and he fits right in my home state of South Dakota, perhaps except for the fact that he's the only guy not wearing socks. Although I will say, Madam President, I have found occasions which have required him to get the socks out of his suitcase. During one of our trips to South Dakota to hunt pheasants, we landed in Sioux Falls, and we got off the plane. It was 7 degrees, and I noticed at the next stop he had socks on. So there are limitations to his practice of not wearing socks. But anyway, one of our favorite pastimes, of course, in South Dakota is pheasant hunting, and I've had Richard out there a number of times during pheasant season. He has a great shot, I will say. He has a favorite place to eat. It's Al's Oasis in Chamberlain, South Dakota, which is known for, among many things, homemade pies. And, of course, I've discovered when Kimberly and I visited Richard and Brooke in North Carolina, he's also a great handyman. Now, apparently he thinks his guests should be as well, since he put me right to work on a new door that he was installing. We hung a door at his house. I was the grunt laborer. He was the architect, the designer, and just said, you know, hold this, you know, that sort of thing. So that was my job. But I was well paid for my trouble because Richard also, in addition to his assets and his attributes as being a handyman, is also an excellent cook. Many of you perhaps here don't know that. But one of the privileges that I've enjoyed in visiting Richard is getting to enjoy his cooking. And he really can make just about anything. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. I'm not saying he ought to open a restaurant in his retirement, but if he did, I would certainly be the first in line at the opening. Richard has certainly left his mark on Washington. His car, a 1974 Volkswagen Thing, often parked outside the Russell Building with the top down no matter the season, and adorned with his colleagues' campaign stickers, I think everybody knows was a fixture here on Capitol Hill. And Richard, who as well as being a handyman is a capable mechanic, could often be found working under the Thing's hood to keep it running, which has become a true labor of love, particularly here in the last few years. But I would say, Madam President, in this chamber, of course, Richard is best known and really known for being an outstanding legislator. And I have to say thank you, as he did, to his outstanding staff. I mean, there isn't anybody here who works here who knows that the heavy lifting in this place gets done by staff. And so we appreciate your many years of service to him and making him such an effective and accomplished legislator. And he mentioned the Capitol staff, the Capitol Police, who are here on a daily basis protecting us. Just say how much we appreciate everything that you have done. But Richard has always been someone who knows how to get things done. In addition to building a great team and staff around him, he knows how to build coalitions, and he knows how to get legislation across the finish line, and that's evident in his record of accomplishment here in the Senate. He talked a little bit about that, but promoting medical research and innovation has been a passion of his. Supporting veterans, changing the way student loan interest rates are set to save families money, working to ensure that child care settings are safe and high quality, establishing ABLE accounts for individuals with disabilities to help better their lives, and the list goes on. Long before COVID, Richard was working to prepare our nation to respond to the threat of a disaster or a pandemic, and since COVID, he's worked to ensure that our nation's future pandemic response reflects the lessons that we have learned. And of course, as he mentioned, his longtime work on the intelligence committees in both the House and the Senate, as chairman here of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the number of hours I know he sat in padded rooms in classified settings, making sure that our country was prepared, working with our intelligence community, as he mentioned, to protect Americans from the threats that we face here at home and around the world. Richard's been a strong advocate for his home state of North Carolina, particularly for veterans. He's worked to bring new VA facilities to North Carolina to ensure that veterans and their families who are exposed to contaminated water at Camp Lejeune receive VA medical care. I think all of us get into this life and the hope that we can one day leave Congress knowing that we've done something to make life better for our fellow Americans. Richard can leave Congress with that assurance. And Madam President, I'm going to miss him. It's a privilege and a blessing when you're able to serve with a friend for so long. I'll miss our daily interactions, but I know that in Congress or not, our friendship will endure. And I look forward to seeing all that Richard's going to do in his next chapter in life. I want to thank, as he said, Brooke, his sons and daughters-in-law, and now grandkids for the many sacrifices that they've made through the years. I think we all know that this doesn't work unless you've got a partner. And Brooke has been a partner for all these 28 years to Richard and a part of everything that he's been able to accomplish here. And so I wish him and his family many more happy hours in the years ahead and congratulate him on his retirement and on a farewell speech that I think we all ought to take to heart. Madam President, I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Virginia.
Madam President, it's with more than a little mixture of sorrow and pride that I rise today to pay tribute to my good friend, the senior senator from North Carolina. I was thinking about the fact that Senator Blunt's sitting in front of you. We were here for his farewell speech the other day, and our good friend Rob Portman was behind you, and we'll be here for his. We're losing a lot of great members this Congress, and folks who are going to follow them will not replace them. They got big shoes to fill. I mean, celebrating Richard's 18 years in the Senate and years on top of that, 10 years in the House, 28 years of doing this stuff. Senator Burr and I first got to know each other actually through a mutual friend. Early on in my Senate career, in kind of a strange series of circumstances, I'd become really great friends with Saxby Chambliss. And Saxby and Richard were running buddies, and so I would run around with him sometimes. And John, Senator Thune, as you know, Richard's a pretty open-minded guy. But I gotta acknowledge, I shouldn't probably do this in front of everyone, that I'm not sure he initially took to me that well. Now, my staff has occasionally called me slightly intense. And Richard has more than a few times asked whether I'm getting my daily meds to stay on that equilibrium. You know, so much for that cheat. But in contrast, Richard Burr is more of a low-key kind of guy. Senator Thune's already made mention, and every senator has made mention, notice, or fun of his lack of socks. We have seen the migration of his thing from outside the Russell Building to where maybe its permanent resting place now in the garage in Hart, but I park next to it almost every day. And I hope you will leave it there in perpetuity. But despite this kind of where we started off and us being a little bit of an odd couple, we have formed an enormously strong partnership, and for me at least, more importantly, a strong friendship. For 5 years, Richard preceded me as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and he had been on the Intelligence Committee since he came to Congress. And I have learned so much from him. Not only on the substance, which is terribly important. There are a whole series of issues, extraordinarily important, where, candidly, I never fully got up to speed because I trusted his judgment. But what really he did was he set the tone for how the committee ought to operate. A committee that, frankly, doesn't get as much attention as most because so much of what we do is behind closed doors. The reason why the Senate Intelligence Committee has stayed bipartisan. The reason why it is so productive, the reason why we get year after year an intelligence authorization bill out virtually unanimous, if never more than 1 or 2 votes against, is a lot due to Richard Burr. My friend, somebody you served with in the House, the dean of the Virginia delegation, Congressman Bobby Scott, has often referred to around Virginia that the Senate Intelligence Committee is an oasis of dignity. I think that's a pretty darn good description. And that dignity would not have come about without Richard Burr's leadership. He's made mention of his staff. I want to echo that, particularly those folks I've had the opportunity to work with on the Intelligence Committee staff. This does not have to be the case. This is not always the model. And I won't make more than a passing reference to HPSI in that comparison. If you don't have not only members agreeing, you got to have staff agreeing. And sometimes staff come with their notion that we got to start with conflict. That was never the way that Richard chaired the committee. He knew my staff as well as he knew his own. And nowhere was that more evident than when he took on one of the greatest challenges, and one where we kind of got battle-hardened together on the Russia investigation. And one of the things I know he had pride in, I had pride in, there was an awful lot of folks that had to be interviewed, and without exception, the folks who got interviewed didn't know whether the interviewees were Republicans or Democrats. It was that kind of professionalism and the notion that we were going to follow the truth. And I think that work product will clearly stand the test of time. The other thing that I think Richard taught me, and this was something that he has been just relentless about, is to recognize the courage and the patriotism of the men and women who work in the intelligence community. They're never going to get the recognition that public officials get. They're not even going to get the recognition that the men and women who serve in our military get. But no matter where you traveled with Senator Burr, there were generally 2 things that you could guarantee would take place. One is, at some moment during the trip, he'd find a way to get a couple hours at whatever the local bazaar was and go buy stuff until Brooke finally said, no more rugs ever again. But what was equally important, he taught me, and I think he taught all of us on the committee who's come after, that when you are out in the field, you make sure you go see station, and not just see the station chief, but make sure you see all the members of the station and personally meet them and thank them. And in every hearing that we've had, and I've tried to continue this tradition, and we may not get along, or we may not agree with the briefers, but at the end of that hearing, no matter how tough it may have been, he thanks the briefers, he thanks the folks who are on the back row, oftentimes not getting to the front table, and he makes sure to say, go back and tell the men and women you work with, back at headquarters, back at station, how much we respect you and will have your back. And he has shared with me a little bit in these last few weeks the kind of outpouring of support that he's had from Intelligence Community members, both here and around the world. And we are going to have him back in January with the leadership of the intelligence community to celebrate that again. The other thing that's a little unusual about Senator Burr, and I say this with a few of our friends from the press, most of us actually like to talk to the press, or at least do it. This has never been high on Senator Burr's list. I've never seen anybody manage to, with a complete politeness, give more non-answers to the questions in the hallway as the press pool follows after him on so many occasions. But it's because it's all about the work. Others have mentioned, he's mentioned, He was and has been the leading voice on disease preparedness. We've listened more to him earlier on things like COVID. I think part of this tragedy could have been even further averted. I mentioned already the Russia investigation. We both took incoming on that from both our sides, wanted us to do it differently. He said, we're going after the truth, and I can assure you there would be no one I would rather be in a foxhole with than Richard Burr. Because when the incoming kept coming in, he said, let's buckle down, do the work. He empowered the staff to do that in a way that was remarkable. And again, that product will stand the test of time. So I'm sad to lose a colleague. I think his admonitions to us were great. I think his recognition, and again, this is so Richard Burr, that he's got so many staff here. And he put the staff not in a passing reference, but was one of the major themes of his speech, because we all would not be here without the kind of men and women that have supported you and support each of us who have the honor of standing on this floor. But I'm going to be really sad to lose at least the daily back and forth as a friend. He's a little bit quirky. He is not shy about giving somebody grief. I'm not sure there'll ever be another senator with the same tastes in footwear or sockwear or lack thereof. He clearly has been one of the Senate's true characters in the best sense of the word. But as he's mentioned, and I had the occasion to get to know Brooke and his kids, and seen lots and lots of pictures of the grandkids. I'm glad some of them live in Richmond, and we will visit there and on the Outer Banks. But he has got a great next chapter in front of him. I think he is going to continue to contribute to this nation in the business world. I look to see where that path leads, and I look to making sure that this friendship that we've built will be maintained long into the future, into our each increasing daughterage going forward. So with that, Madam President, I yield the floor and salute my dear friend, Richard Burr. Thank you.
President.
Distinguished senior senator from Maine, and Senator Burr knows the one thing he was also extraordinarily critical of was whenever members of the Intel Committee were late to an Intel meeting, and we have one at 2:30. So, Senator Burr, I hope I have your ability, and Senator Collins will give me a rundown on our comments later. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
The senator from Maine.
Madam President, how heartwarming it has been today to witness Richard Burr's farewell speech to his colleagues, his staff, the members of the Senate, his constituents, and indeed all Americans. And equally heartwarming it has been to listen to the heartfelt tributes that he is receiving from those of us who have been privileged to share with him. During his 28 years in Congress, as both a member of the House and of the Senate, Richard has been a strong voice for responsible government and bipartisanship. And I join my colleagues in thanking him for his truly extraordinary service, not just to the people of his beloved North Carolina, but to all of our country. Throughout his service, Richard has consistently reached across the aisle to meet challenges and to move our nation forward. As the leader of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, he has supported innovations in our healthcare system that have made a real difference for his fellow Americans. These advancements include enhancing the ability of cutting-edge treatments and medications to reach patients as well as advocating for historic funding increases for biomedical research. Richard has also left a lasting mark on educational policy for Americans of all ages. He has worked to ensure that the very youngest learners have the best possible opportunities in life by supporting early education through Head Start and quality child care and after-school programs through the Child Care Development Block Grant. He has sought to increase the affordability of higher education by authoring the Bipartisan Student Loan Certainty Act. And he has helped Americans obtain good-paying jobs by strengthening workforce development programs. Richard was also a member of the bipartisan group that shepherded the Great American Outdoors Act through Congress. 2 years ago, I was proud to join him when that bipartisan bill was signed into law. This historic legislation fully funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund that supports access to the great outdoors for all Americans. It is preserving and creating recreational opportunities from the Outer Banks to the Pacific coast. Perhaps less well known, but also important, is the fact that Richard has been a champion of civil rights. He spearheaded the passage of the ABLE Act, one of the most important laws for individuals with disabilities since the Americans with Disabilities Act. He partnered with Congressman John Lewis, the late civil rights icon, to reauthorize the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crimes Act, to right the wrongs committed against African Americans that were never investigated. When in 2010, former Senator Joe Lieberman and I led the fight to repeal the discriminatory Don't Ask, Don't Tell law that prohibited patriotic Americans from serving in the military due to sexual orientation, Richard stepped forward to help ensure that successful repeal. As chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Richard oversaw the agencies that helped to keep our nation safe and ensured that they had the tools needed to guard against foreign threats. In addition, as Senator Warner has mentioned, at a time of intense partisanship, he led the investigation into Russian attempts to meddle in U.S. elections. He deserves enormous credit for keeping our committee focused on the task at hand and for producing a fact-based account of the events surrounding the 2016 election. There is a final story that I want to end with about Richard, and it is repeating in many ways what our chairman, Mark Warner, has said. I, too, have accompanied Richard Burr as he has visited with our men and women of the intelligence community at stations around the world. And he doesn't just receive the intelligence briefings, as you would expect. No, he goes beyond that. He makes the effort to thank each and every one of our intelligence community staff who are serving in stations, sometimes in dangerous conditions, often separated by their families or enduring hardship. He thanks each and every one of them. And that tells you a lot about who Richard Burr is. Richard, Thank you for your countless contributions to the United States Congress and to our nation. And I join your friends and colleagues in wishing you and Brooke all the best in the years to come. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President,
The senator from Missouri.
calculating it may be possible that I've served on the Intel Committee longer than anybody besides Richard Burr, currently on the committee, sometime in the House, not all the time in the House and in the Senate, and it is truly amazing the depth of understanding he has of programs, of capacity, of places we are all over the world. I think he and Senator Warner have done a great job of maintaining that committee as a bipartisan committee, working together, understanding that most of what we do and most of what we talk about is only seen by us and the staff of that committee. The important responsibility to ask questions and hear answers that other members can't. But Richard's leadership has been incredible there. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the other portfolio he has that I'm also involved in as the appropriating chairman on the Health and Education and Labor Committee. In so many ways, particularly after COVID, Richard, we became the team, the authorizing and the appropriating. Can we make this all work together? And there his efforts are extraordinary as well. We've heard the long list of things he did to create an understanding of what we needed to do. The whole idea of rapid response, of BARDA, of having a stockpile, all of this is not only so much of it Richard's idea, but also Richard has kept the idea alive. I'll just tell you from absolute personal and occasionally knowledge in the press, wondering, now why are you still spending that money on the stockpile? We didn't use it last year. We didn't use it the year before. Why do you think we need to have things in that stockpile that are usable and have efficacy now? Richard been there. Often the only people advocating for the stockpile, advocating for being ready for things we hope don't happen, are the manufacturer who's willing to manufacture this, and Richard Burr, and others who, a very small group of people who say we've got to be ready. Now we're talking about, with Richard's leadership, again, being ready in other ways, where we're ready to manufacture and have a rapid response like we did with COVID, where we now maybe have the capacity to figure out very quickly what we need and produce that. But you've got to have the kind of relationship to have that rapid production. You know, when something like this happens, everybody's willing to do everything, and frankly, everybody's willing to spend everything, but that's likely too late. You had to be willing to plan everything and be prepared to execute a plan rather than, now we've got a problem, let's do whatever it takes. Richard Burr's been there in thinking about how we plan, how we prepare, what kind of relationships we need to have. And on top of that, the biomedical research, the new interest in synthetic biology, so much of that leaves this building and this floor when Richard leaves. I think there's so many ways he can be and will be available to the country and a service to the country, but showing up every day in every Congress, in every session, at every meeting, with the knowledge he's brought to those issues is incredibly important. And you know, we see the possibility of health used in a warlike way. We see the interest in the need to look into this and see what has happened or what could happen. And let me just say, from the health, labor, and education job that I've had, I've been able to see, maybe like nobody else has, the health, education, and labor commitment and understanding he has. I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for his friendship. I look forward to things he and I can continue to find to do together, but I'm grateful for the fact that he's been here when he was so needed and stepped up in such a significant way. Our good friend Lamar Alexander on that committee in the height of COVID, also very close to both of us, very dedicated to this work. And when Lamar left, I said, one of the things I'm most grateful was I got to serve in the Senate that included Lamar Alexander. I'm also grateful I got to serve in a Senate that included Richard Burr.
Senator from Ohio.
Madam President, I am here on the floor to congratulate my friend from North Carolina, the Tar Heel State. We go back a few years. He's from Winston-Salem, where my wife is from. Our spouses actually waitressed together back in Winston-Salem during high school, and they're still buddies. And Brooke and Richard are dear friends. More importantly for today, Richard has been a terrific representative of the state of North Carolina, first in the House of Representatives, where I served with him when I was a member there from Ohio. And then he snuck over to the Senate, a little bit ahead of me, kind of laid the groundwork. And we've had the opportunity to work on so much together, Richard. And I think of every major bipartisan achievement in this place, and you will see Richard's fingerprints on it. So to his staff who are here, I know those are your fingerprints as much as his. So congratulations. And they haven't always been easy issues. And sometimes they put Richard in a difficult political position. But he did what he thought was right for his beloved state of North Carolina and for the country. So today I've heard a lot about health care. I like health care. That's great to talk about it. But I want to talk about something else. But first on health care, I must say, on Operation Warp Speed, remarkably successful. I think everyone has to acknowledge that now. No one in this chamber was more responsible for laying the groundwork for that than Richard Burr. And I'm not sure people understand that. But all the discussion about your interest in innovation, your work on health care, I think that's one that perhaps needs to be emphasized. You've also done a good job in other areas, as was talked about today, the Intelligence Committee in particular. And I will tell you, Richard and I have traveled the world a little bit together, and we'll go to some hotspot and I'll be dutifully going to the meetings, with the political leadership of the country, and Richard will disappear. And he'll show up a few hours later, and we'll have a good conversation about things he's not allowed to tell me about, so he doesn't tell me everything. But the bottom line is he is in touch with intelligence people, not just here in Washington, but around the world, and expressing our support for them and our encouragement for them for the difficult jobs that they do on behalf of our country, and really, keeping the world a less dangerous and a less volatile place. So, Richard, I've seen you in action on that. But I want to talk about something else, which is his love of the outdoors and his work on conservation. We are co-chairs of what's called the International Conservation Caucus, and this is a group of members of 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, Senator Whitehouse and Senator Coons are the Democrats, Senator Burr and I are the Republicans, who talk about international conservation issues around the world. And these are issues that are directly related to economic development, directly related to security, to terrorism. You think about it, the wildlife trafficking that goes on in places like Africa, where people are trafficking in ivory or rhino horns and so on. So much of that is related to providing funding for terrorist groups over there and causing a lot of insecurity in those areas. Same thing in terms of economic development. Many of these natural areas, once destroyed, don't provide the ability for clean water, for food, for ecotourism, which brings in money for these countries. So it's all related, but ultimately I think Richard got involved because of his love of nature and the outdoors, and the biodiversity that he has helped to maintain around the world, not just here in this country, has been one of the beneficiaries. There's a piece of this that I think also hasn't gotten enough notice today. That's my job to sort of clean up here for some, and that's not just his work on what was called the Great American Outdoors Act. And there was a number of provisions in there. One of mine was on the national parks that Richard helped me with, on restoring our national parks. But there's one piece in there that I believe would not have been successful without Richard's advocacy over many years. He really wanted to make sure that we put our money where our mouth was in terms of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, LWCF. If you don't know what that is, then ask any of your county commissioners or governors or others who take advantage of it, township trustees, community leaders, certainly conservation groups, because this is funding that helps with matching funding, typically local, state, sometimes other federal funding, to ensure that areas are protected, that parks can be built, and so on. And Congress is very good about saying, we're all for that, we're going to, what we call around here, authorize the legislation to do that, but then we didn't provide the money. And what Richard said over the years was, well, if this is such a good idea, why don't we fund it like we're supposed to? And that was actually falling on deaf ears for quite a while, I think it's fair to say. But Richard was persistent. And I recall being at the White House signing ceremony for that larger legislation, the Great American Outdoors Act, and knowing that one of the most significant elements of that was full funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And that was because of one senator, and that's Richard Burr. So Richard, it's been a pleasure to serve alongside you. I wish you and Brooke and William and Tyler the very best going forward. I suspect if you want to see Richard, you're going to have to go to his beloved North Carolina shore, particularly the Outer Banks, where you might see him fishing for tuna or doing something else very productive. So Godspeed, my friend.
President.
Senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. We've heard a lot of great comments. First, we heard great words from Senator Burr. I hope that people yield and learn, excuse me, from the lessons. We've also heard a lot about his body of work over the 28 years that he's been in the House and the Senate. And he mentioned Speaker Boehner earlier, who was probably crying as he listened to Richard's comments. I have a tendency, when I see a friend leaving, to get a little sappy too. So to make sure that we keep Speaker Boehner on the leaderboard for the one who cries the most, I want to talk a little bit about our relationship. We knew each other before I came here. I was Speaker of the House when I first met him. But I've learned a lot from him over the last 8 years. And I've seen him work in a way that is unique among many members. I feel like you sum up Richard Burr by his patience, his practicality, and his persistence. He's a very patient person. He doesn't think in terms of, we've got to get this done this Congress. He looks at the reality of the situation and he just continues to build support until he gets it done. He's practical. He looks at something, the face of the policy, and he decides whether it makes sense. And he's willing to take the political hits to get good policy done. Policy, to use Richard's words, that have purpose and meaning. And man, is he persistent. We've had a lot of people talk about the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I watched him work this, and he worked it for quite some time. And when it was finally set up to get passed, he was making a few people in his own conference a little bit uncomfortable because of his encyclopedic knowledge of procedure. And I can remember one scene when he was walking down this aisle when we were working to get agreement, that it reminded me of a scene in a Western comedy from many years ago. People down there were saying, don't shoot them, it'll just make them mad. He knows how to get things done, and I've learned a lot from him. And I'm going to miss him. But with all due respect to John Boehner, I'm going to have your friendship for the rest of my life. Thank you, Madam Chair.